There is a place beneath the heart of Rome where no one may enter without permission. A place where history is not displayed but locked away, hidden in the deepest rooms, behind 3 layers of iron doors between walls that carry no echo. There, the Vatican has preserved millions of pages of documents for over 12 centuries, not to reveal them, but to wait. Handwritten letters from popes that were never sent, bans on books that changed the world, records of Marian apparitions that were quietly dismissed, whispers exchanged between the Vatican and emperors, fascists, and Western intelligence, and works of art the world has never seen. Why does the Vatican keep all of this, but never speak of it? This is not a story about conspiracy. This is a story about the most deeply buried memories in the world of faith. Welcome to Secrets of the Vatican Archives, where we don't repeat what's already been told, but slowly uncover what was meant to be hidden. I was once one of the few granted access to the restricted section of the Vatican Archives. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a cardinal, not a famous historian, and I certainly didn't come from any noble bloodline. I was just a caretaker, a custode, as the Italians say. My job was to clean, to take notes, and to deliver approved documents to the scholars. But on certain nights, when the old priest had dozed off and the oil lamp burned quietly in the corner, I would quietly open doors that no one else dared to approach. And from that moment on, there was no turning back. I know now that I do not have much time left. In these final years, my heart beats slower, my eyes grow dim in the candlelight, and my hands begin to tremble when they touch the parchment that once felt as familiar as my own skin. But before all of it vanishes with me, I must speak. Not to shock, not to accuse or to absolve, but so that someone out there may understand. Truth has never fully belonged to the light, nor to the darkness. It dwells in the space between, waiting to be heard. I have seen the letters never sent by Pope Pius XV resting quietly in an unmarked drawer. I have read forbidden copies of books once listed as threats to the faith. I have stood before paintings by Caravaggio that were never displayed, because the eyes in those portraits looked straight into a kind of pain theology dared not face. And most of all, I have come to know what we are not permitted to reveal is not hidden because it is false, but because it is too true to be accepted. I do not ask you to believe me. I cannot offer proof the world would recognize. But if you are still listening, if you are still reading, and if somewhere inside you still believe that beneath every haloed glory there lies something deeper, something unresolved, then perhaps you are the one I must say this to, because one day those doors will not remain closed forever. And when they open, you will understand why I could never return. I used to believe the Vatican was simply a religious symbol, a place of prayers, of popes in white robes standing in the open air of St. Peter's Square. But that was just the surface. Behind the ancient stone walls, beneath the towering domes, and behind doors locked with triple mechanisms, lies a world most of humanity will never be allowed to see. The world of the Vatican's secret archives. People often call it the Vatican Secret Archives, but its official name in Latin is Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, which means the private archive of the Pope. The word secretum in Latin doesn't mean secret in the modern sense, it means private. This archive belongs to the Pope personally, It does not belong to the Catholic Church as a whole, and yet that very privacy is what has made this place the subject of so many theories, from political investigations to the search for lost legends. The archive spans roughly 85 kilometers of shelving, with over 35,000 catalogued entries, covering events from the 8th century to the present. But only a small portion is accessible to scholars. The most sensitive, classified or unreleased documents remain sealed deep within the inner vaults, and it is there that some of the most pivotal and controversial moments in the history of Europe and Christianity are preserved. Among the preserved items is a copy of the letter Galileo Galilei sent to the Church in 1613, in which he tried to argue that his views on astronomy did not contradict the Bible. However, in 1616, the Church declared heliocentrism heretical and banned its teaching. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, a tribunal whose activities are also recorded deep within these archives. One of the most searched collections relates to the trial of the Knights Templar in the 14th century. For hundreds of years, it was believed that the Vatican had destroyed all records of the trial. But in 2001, an Italian scholar named Barbara Fraile discovered a copy of the Pergamentum Shinum, a document revealing that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templars. This finding directly contradicted the long-held belief that the Church had agreed to their destruction. It raised a haunting question. Why was that truth hidden for more than 700 years? Then there are documents about the Vatican's relationships with authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, especially Nazi Germany. The archives contain hundreds of letters exchanged between the Vatican and Hitler's regime, along with reports sent from German bishops to the Holy See. These materials suggest the Vatican had early knowledge of the mass killings of Jews, but their response was deeply complicated, shaped by faith, political calculation, and fear of persecution. In 2020, after decades of controversy, the Vatican finally opened part of the archive related to Pope Pius X, who led the Church from 1939 to 1958 during the years of World War II. This was a groundbreaking moment for historians, as Pius XIII had long been accused of remaining silent during the Holocaust. The newly released documents revealed a more complex picture. He was not entirely silent, but chose to act quietly behind the scenes to save lives, a strategy that still sparks debate over its morality and effectiveness. But the archives are not limited to religious affairs. They also contain handwritten letters by Michelangelo, sketches by Bernini, a farewell note from Mary, Queen of Scots, before her execution, and even a letter from a Native American chief to the Pope in the 19th century. The Vatican archives are like a gateway connecting all of history, from the bloodshed of the Crusades to the revolutions of science, from theological schisms to modern political intrigue. Despite holding such a treasure of history, access to the archive is strictly limited. Each year, only around 60 to 80 scholars are allowed to study on site. They must apply, specify their research topic, and follow strict rules. No photographs, no photocopies, and no documents may leave the room. Most importantly, no one is allowed unrestricted access. The most sensitive areas remain sealed. I'm not trying to draw conclusions. I don't claim to know all the truth, but I believe that when you stand before the endless shelves with centuries-old dust resting on trembling handwritten lines from the 10th century, you begin to understand why the Vatican guards this place so carefully. Some truths are too vast to be exposed. Some stories once told would force us to question the very foundations of our civilization and our faith. If there were a single document that could illustrate the sensitivity and power held within the Vatican archives, it would likely be the records of Christianity's Great Divide, the schism between Catholicism and Protestantism. Few people, Know that in the early days of the Reformation, secret exchanges between Martin Luther and certain Vatican representatives were carefully recorded. These handwritten notes, written in slanted brown ink, once moved a Dutch scholar to tears, not because of religious disagreement, but because the documents revealed that both sides had once tried to prevent the split, only to be driven apart by pride and power. As early as the 1530s, the Vatican quietly dispatched envoys to the German principalities to negotiate with the reformist factions. Among the documents are statements by Bishop Girolamo Aleandro, a theologian and diplomat, who once proposed rare theological concessions to preserve the unity of the Church. But when Luther's responses arrived, cautious yet firm, the Church turned away, and history took an irreversible path. These materials are kept in a sealed dossier, accessible only to those with advanced research credentials and a clearly justified purpose. Another subject that once sent a chill down my spine was the record of the Inquisition. The Vatican still holds thousands of indictments, interrogation transcripts, and death sentences from those accused of heresy between the 12th and 19th centuries. One of the most infamous cases is that of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, astrologer, and advocate of the theory of a boundless universe. The documents on Bruno reveal not only his intellectual arguments, but also the inner conflict of the clergy who had to judge him. In one internal note, a cleric wrote, "If we spare him, doctrine will waver, but if we burn him, history will never forgive us." In the end, Bruno was executed in 1600 at Campo de' Fiori. The long silence that followed for centuries remains one of the clearest reflections of the enduring tension between faith and knowledge. The archives also contain a vast collection of records on the Vatican's interactions with secular empires, particularly Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon invaded Italy, he ordered the most valuable Vatican documents to be shipped to Paris. Dozens of thousands of items were boxed, sealed, and carried across the Alps. Many never returned. What the Vatican did manage to reclaim after Napoleon's defeat is still specially classified. I once saw a handwritten note by Pope Pius VII describing the feeling of losing the soul of the Church as ancient texts were loaded onto French wagons. The document was written in charcoal ink with small, meticulous script, and at the bottom of the page was a single line: "We have been stripped bare." One of the most surprising revelations comes from diplomatic correspondence between the Vatican and Asian nations. Few people know that in the 17th century, the Vatican secretly exchanged letters with the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, even while Christianity was banned there. The letters were sent through Portuguese missionaries, hidden in merchant ships and concealed inside small wooden statues to avoid detection. One letter from 1611, ordered by Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, stated clearly, "We do not accept a faith that divides families, but we respect the knowledge and loyalty your missionaries bring." The Vatican preserved that letter carefully as a quiet monument to the first, and failed, diplomatic contact with a closed Asian empire. And then there is a little-known section of the archive dedicated to maps and blueprints of lost churches, monasteries, fortresses, and catacombs. Among them are maps showing the locations of ancient dioceses that vanished due to war, plague, or political upheaval. One that still haunts me is the floor plan of Montségur Abbey, the site of a siege and mass burning in 1244 during the Crusade against the Cathars. On that map, there is a strange marking, an escape route that does not appear in any official records. No one knows if the last Cathars managed to flee, but the document remains neither confirmed nor denied, and like many other secrets in this archive, it stands as a reminder that history has never been a simple story. Deep within the most heavily guarded section of the archives, I remember one room in particular, a place that holds records categorized under political affiliations, between the Vatican and global powers from the 19th century to the present day. The boxes are neatly arranged by country, each one a fragment of memory, a piece of truth untouched by the narratives found in official history. Most people know that the Vatican became an independent state in 1929 after the Lateran Treaty between Pope Pius V and Benito Mussolini. But few truly understand that before that, from 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy annexed the Papal States, the Vatican lived in a state of near isolation for almost 60 years. It was a nation without borders, existing within the heart of Rome. During that time, the popes refused to recognize the Italian government and never stepped beyond the Vatican walls. And it was in this tense period that the Church quietly built an elaborate network of secret communication with other nations, especially France, Austria, Spain, and the United States. One document from 1922 reveals that the Vatican once sent a confidential message to U.S. President Warren G. Harding, offering to act as a mediator between America and divided Catholic nations in post-World War I Europe. This episode has never appeared in official history books because the Vatican had no legal status as a state at the time. Yet the memorandum still exists with a signature and seal intact. When I first touched it, the paper was brittle, the corners darkened with age, but the text was vivid, as if history itself was whispering in my ear. The World War II era brought an avalanche of sensitive material. Dozens of reports sent from local bishops to the Vatican clearly document the mass murder of Jews in Poland, Germany, and even France. One report, dated 1942 and sent from Krakow, was written by Cardinal Adam Sapieha, later the spiritual advisor to Pope John Paul II. He wrote, "If we do not speak, we will bear the guilt of complicity before God." Yet even such urgent pleas did not change the Vatican's calculated silence. Why did the Vatican delay its condemnation of genocide? Scholars have long debated whether it was a strategy to protect the Church and its followers in occupied territories. But one document I once read, handwritten by a member of the Papal Council, revealed a deeper complexity. It warned of the risk of losing control over the faithful if belief is pulled into the vortex of political ideology. In other words, the Vatican feared that taking sides might fracture the global Church itself. That silence lasted until the 1960s, when the Vatican began one of the most significant reforms in modern Church history, the Second Vatican Council. The files from that council form one of the largest and most intricate sections of the archive. Thousands of pages document theological debates, political responses, transcripts of bishop speeches, and analyses of the Church's shifting authority in a rapidly changing world. I once read the transcript of a debate between two high-ranking cardinals over whether to allow the use of local languages instead of Latin during Mass. One said, "If we abandon Latin, we abandon the symbol of eternity." The other replied, "If we don't change, we abandon the people." The council was not just about language. It marked the Vatican's first real opening to dialogue with Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, and even atheists. The archive still holds an unpublished draft of a speech in which Pope Paul VI intended to issue a formal apology for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust. In the end, the speech was replaced with a more neutral version. No one knows exactly why. Only a handwritten note in the margin remains. In Latin, tempus non domest. The time has not yet come. As I turned the pages of these records, I never saw the kind of global conspiracy that wild theories often suggest. What I saw was a struggle between faith and politics, between morality and survival. The Vatican archives do not lie. They wait for someone patient and brave enough to read, to understand, and to accept that history has never been black or white, but always grey. There is one section of the archives that has always weighed heavily on me, the records concerning the relationship between the Vatican and colonial empires, especially during the 15th to 19th centuries. The faded pages inside those boxes contain no direct accusations, no formal statements of support for war or the stripping of freedom. Yet between the carefully written lines lies a quiet truth. Faith once moved alongside the sword of European colonialism as it spread across the globe. In 1493, just 1 year after Christopher Columbus arrived in the New World, Pope Alexander V issued the papal bull Inter Caetera. In this decree, he divided the non-Christian world into two zones of influence, one for Spain, the other for Portugal, as if the Church held the authority to distribute global territory. That document still rests within the Vatican archives, filed in a thick folder labeled Decrees Concerning the New World. It is written in formal Latin, bearing the crimson seal of the Holy See. Holding it in my hands, I felt a chill, for this marked a moment when faith was politicized to its most extreme degree. Attached to that decree are letters exchanged between the Vatican and monarchs of Portugal, Spain, and later France and Belgium. In them, the Pope requested assurances for the spread of the faith and the protection of missionaries in newly acquired territories. But the reality on the ground was often bloodshed, cultural erasure, and cries for help from protesting clergy. Their voices preserved in small numbers, but present, like sparks of light in a deep darkness. One such voice was that of Father Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote to Pope Paul III in 1537. In his letter, he described mass executions of indigenous people in the Caribbean, churches built upon blood-soaked soil, and the silence of religious authorities in the face of atrocity. Reading that letter was suffocating. It did not feel like a prayer. It felt like a plea for help, not only for the victims, but for the very conscience of the Church. Also preserved in the archives is a draft of the apostolic brief Sublimis Deus, issued in 1537 by Pope Paul III. In it, he declared that indigenous peoples of the Americas were truly human, with souls and the right to receive the gospel, and that they should not be enslaved. It was a progressive document for its time. Yet tragically, its application was quickly withdrawn under pressure from European monarchs who refused to give up the economic gains of slavery. As one moves into the 19th century, the Vatican's diplomatic role in protecting religious interests within African and Asian colonies becomes increasingly apparent. In the archives related to Indochina, I once read through a thick dossier detailing the presence of French missionaries in Vietnam before the French invasion. There were letters sent back to Rome describing the pressures faced by Catholic converts under the Nguyen dynasty, but interwoven into those reports were phrases such as opportunity to expand influence and mediating role with Western merchants, lines that reveal how faith and secular power had begun to merge in ways that were difficult to separate. It is important to note that the Vatican did not directly order colonial conquests. Yet, through the stamps of approval, the formal blessings, and the moral legitimacy it extended, one can trace the Church's role in validating empires and in soothing the conscience of those who conquered. The Vatican archives also contain many records that reveal internal dissent. Not a few priests, monks, and bishops protested the abuse of religion for colonial purposes. One document from 1885 tells of a French bishop in the Congo who submitted a formal protest to the Vatican after witnessing hundreds of people have their hands cut off for failing to meet rubber quotas for King Leopold II's company. The Vatican's response was recorded in a single brief line: "We pray for them, but intervention is beyond reach." Perhaps that is why the Vatican archives are not just a repository of memory. They are also a mirror reflecting the fragile boundary between faith and politics, between righteousness and power. As I look at the cracked, red wax seals, the signatures of popes, cardinals, kings, and merchants, I am reminded that history is never linear, and the Vatican, for all its sanctity, was once a participant in decisions that reshaped the course of human civilization. If you believe the Vatican's role in politics ended in the Middle Ages or during World War II, you might be surprised to learn that the archives continue to record significant moments of history well into the latter half of the 20th century. One of the most secure areas in the Vatican archives houses the diplomatic records of the Holy See's engagement with global powers during the Cold War, particularly in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Soviet Union. I remember vividly the first time I accessed the thick file on Poland in the 1970s, the period when the Solidarity movement began to emerge as a symbol of anti-communist resistance. Many people know that Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope, supported this movement, but few realize that the Vatican, through covert channels, sent funds, printing equipment, and even intelligence to opposition groups. These actions are documented clearly in the internal reports. One memorandum sent from the Vatican Secretariat of State to the Apostolic Nuncio in Warsaw bears the handwritten note of Cardinal Casaroli. This is not only a defense of faith, this is a moment of survival. These documents reveal that the Vatican was not merely a passive observer, but a sophisticated political actor, using soft power to influence major shifts in the global order. Poland was not the only focus. The Vatican also intervened deeply in Latin America. In one confidential file concerning Argentina during the years 1976 to 1983, the period of the Dirty War, I came across troubling reports, pleas from local bishops, lists of kidnapped priests, and the Vatican's conflicted responses. 1. Telegram from Buenos Aires referenced Father Carlos Mujica, who was assassinated for supporting the poor and opposing military violence. But the Vatican's reply simply stated, "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." That sentence stayed with me for a long time, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it reflected the Vatican's traditional strategy, to act quietly, remain publicly neutral, yet offer discreet support to the side it believed was just. In Chile, during the rule of Augusto Pinochet, the archives show periods of silence and moments of indirect pressure. A fully recorded private meeting between Cardinal Angelo Sodano and Chilean military leaders includes a message expressing concern that the Church is being perceived as a refuge for enemies of the regime. At the same time, records confirm that the Vatican protected priests who were sheltering political fugitives, not by public decree, but through internal memos requesting the reinstatement of dismissed bishops sympathetic to the opposition. The Cold War also brought complex dynamics to the Vatican's relationship with the Soviet Union. Though Catholicism was heavily persecuted in Soviet territories, the Vatican maintained discreet communication channels. A typed report dated March 12, 1962, details a confidential meeting between an unofficial Vatican envoy and a representative of Khrushchev's government in Vienna. The conversation was not explosive. They discussed religious freedom and clerical safety. But the fact that the meeting occurred sent a clear message. The Vatican was willing to talk if it could save lives and preserve faith. It is important to note that the Vatican did not always stand on the side of justice, at least not in the way the outside world often hopes. In the case of Spain under Franco, the Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with the dictatorship for decades. Some scholars call this a compromise with authoritarianism to protect the faithful. Letters preserved in the archives show that bishops could disagree but ultimately followed orders from above. For a long time, I thought the Vatican archives would be filled with mystical secrets, ancient scriptures, or lost relics. But after years of study, I've come to understand this. The most shocking discoveries are not things beyond history, but truths that are all too real, too political, too close to what still surrounds us today, truths many would rather not confront. The Vatican is not a supernatural force. It is a political religious entity operating with logic, strategy, and careful calculation. And its archives, not the stained glass windows or the holy statues, are the place where this complex reality is laid bare in its most honest form. Of all the rooms I have ever entered inside the Vatican archives, none has left me as silent as the one marked P12 Pius XII. That name tied to the Pope who reigned from 1939 to 1958, a period that aligned almost entirely with World E. War II and the post-war era remains at the center of one of the most enduring debates in modern history. Did the Vatican do enough, say enough, or remain silent for too long in the face of the 20th century's most brutal genocide? For decades, the records relating to Pius XIII were sealed, dividing historians around the world. Some have called him the Pope of Silence. Others defend him as a cautious diplomat, forced into silence to preserve lives that public words could never have saved. Then, in 2020, when the Vatican officially declassified a portion of the documents from his papacy, a wave of astonishment swept through the scholarly world. I was among the few present at the archives when the materials were first opened. I remember clearly the first time I unfolded the file titled simply Attività del Santo Padre durante il conflitto, the activities of the Holy Father during the conflict. Inside were letters, reports, and telegrams, many from bishops in Germany, Poland, and Hungary, sent between 1941 and 1944. One letter from the Archbishop of Lviv, dated March 16, 1942, described how more than 1,000 Jewish residents were expelled from the town without formal charges or any official sentence. At the end, he pleaded with the Vatican to intervene, or at least to speak out. The Vatican's response, attached just after, consisted of only a few lines. We share in the sorrow, but prayer is the most powerful weapon we possess at this moment. It was not a refusal to help, but clearly it was not an action strong enough to stop what was unfolding. There was a thick folder marked separately, titled Richieste di aiuto e asilo, requests for help and asylum. Inside were hundreds of personal appeals from Jews, priests, scholars, and even artists writing directly to the Holy See for protection. Some were assisted, hidden in convents, aided by nuns, or given forged documents identifying them as Catholics to escape detection by German forces, but others received no reply. One particular page froze me in place. It was a handwritten list of 44 names. Beside each name were their addresses, religions, ages, and a note, sheltered at the Santa Brigida convent. The document was dated October 10, 1943, just 3 days after German forces began rounding up Jews in Rome. Of the 44 people listed, cross-referenced records show that only 12 survived. And then there is a detail that few know, something only visible to those who have read the pages themselves. Between 1942 and 1944, the Vatican sent multiple communiques to the German embassy in Rome requesting a reduction in persecution in areas where Catholic Jews resided. These letters were never made public. They contained no strong language, no use of the word crime, no mention of genocide. Instead, they spoke in diplomatic terms, concerns for social stability, the need to safeguard the sacred right to life. Perhaps that was the only viable language left in that moment. But for future generations, that caution has remained a source of sorrow and debate. The archive also preserves an entire chapter on post-war appeals from Jewish communities. In 1945, a delegation representing European Jewry wrote to the Holy See, asking for confirmation that Catholic institutions had sheltered Jewish children during the war, and requesting that those children be returned to surviving relatives. The Vatican responded, "We will permit it only if the children choose freely to leave their current environment." But many of these children were only 5 or 6 years old at the time. Most remembered nothing beyond the convent walls and the faith into which they had been recently baptized. That moral wound would remain open for years. Among the thousands of pages, I came across a draft of a speech never delivered, prepared for Easter of 1943. In it, one line read, "We cannot close our eyes to the cries of a people cast out. Though they do not bear the name of Christ, they are still human beings." That line never reached the public. The final version of the speech was revised, and that passage was removed. No explanation was provided, only a red stamp remained. Riservato. Non pubblicare. Reserved. Do not publish. What I saw does not give me the right to draw conclusions. I was not in their place. I did not carry the weight of a global institution during wartime. But I understand why many call the Vatican archives a place of delayed truths. Not because those truths were lost, but because no one was ready to face them until much later. People often think of the Vatican as a Western institution, tied to Europe and the history of Christianity on the old continent. But the documents buried deep within the archives reveal something different. From a very early stage, the Vatican had a vision that reached beyond borders, toward the East. And it was in those yellowed pages that I first understood the true scale of the Church's missionary ambitions, its attempts at dialogue, and the profound, often conflicting, encounters between Catholicism and Asia. One section of the archives is titled Missioni d'Oriente, Eastern Missions. It contains thousands of documents dating from the 16th to the 20th centuries. Written in Latin, Italian, French, Classical Chinese, and Japanese, these texts chronicle centuries of European missionaries traveling eastward, carrying not only the Bible but the values of an entirely different world. I began with a file labeled simply Cina, Lettere dei Gesuiti. It is a collection of letters sent by Jesuit priests to the Vatican from China between 1580 and 1773. Among them, the writings of Matteo Ricci stand out, the first Westerner to enter the Forbidden City. In his letters, Ricci expresses admiration for the Confucian moral system and proposes that the Vatican adapt Catholic doctrine to Chinese culture rather than impose it. Not everyone agreed. The archives record fierce debates within the Vatican that lasted for decades, centered around whether Chinese converts should be allowed to continue ancestral rites alongside their Catholic faith. Eventually, Pope Clement V issued a decree forbidding what became known as the Chinese rites. This decision severely damaged relations with the Qing dynasty, and by 1721 missionary activity in China was completely banned. Another file, classified under highly confidential diplomacy, contains documents on Vatican-Japan relations. Among them is a letter written in Chinese characters from Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1610, translated and preserved with remarkable directness. "Your religion disrupts the internal order. It divides fathers and sons, masters and servants. I do not allow it." What followed was a long series of tragic reports. Mass executions of Catholics in Nagasaki, priests burned alive, churches demolished. Yet from those fragments I read astonishing resilience. Handwritten letters by imprisoned Japanese believers sent to the Vatican via Portuguese trading ships, written in blood on scraps of cloth. There was no mysticism, no dramatization, only human beings who believed in something greater than themselves and who paid the ultimate price for that belief. Then I entered a different world, the documents relating to Vietnam. The current here had its own distinct character. Caught between East and West, between faith and sovereignty, between mission and politics, one file from 1790 preserved a letter from Bishop Pignot de Béhaine to the Vatican reporting his efforts to help Prince Nguyen An, later Emperor Jia Long, rebuild his forces and reclaim the throne. That letter was not just a missionary report. It was living evidence that Catholicism played a role in shaping modern Vietnamese statehood, not merely as a foreign religion, but as an agent in nation-building. But the archives also record the darker chapters. The anti-Christian edicts of the Nguyen dynasty, the executions of believers, the desperate pleas from missionaries. One document from 1833 recounts the Le Van Khoi rebellion, noted to have some support from Catholic communities, and the Vatican's cautious reaction: "We must not allow faith to become entangled with rebellion." That line reflected a quiet tension between the desire to protect the faithful and the fear of being drawn into uncontrollable local conflicts. In the 20th century, the Vatican-Vietnam relationship grew even more complex. One file covering the period from 1954 to 1975 is dense, with reports on Catholic life in the north, the mass migration to the south, and the influence of the Saigon government in episcopal appointments. A letter from Pope Pius I to President Ngo Dinh Diem offered blessings but carried a subtle message. A national leader has the duty not only to defend the faith, but to ensure justice for all his subjects. It was one of the few documents written in a tone both supportive and cautionary. What troubled me most, perhaps, was a special file documenting the failed efforts to restore diplomatic relations between the Vatican and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam after 1975. Internal notes reveal the Vatican's patience, its repeated offers for dialogue, and its hope to re-establish a humanitarian channel. But every meeting ended at the level of polite formality. A 1989 memorandum read, "We must wait. Patience is part of the mission." Even in the pages that remained silent, I could feel the weight of history. Every letter, every red seal, was more than administrative paper. It was a trace of the long and difficult interaction between civilizations. The Vatican did not always act rightly nor fully understand the East, but the presence of thousands of documents on Asia at the heart of the Vatican is proof of something deeper. This was never a separate world. It has always been a living, enduring part of global history. I once thought of the Vatican as a unified whole, a perfect organizational pyramid with no room for internal dissent. But it was only deep within the archives that I began to understand. The Vatican is also a living entity, full of disputes, contradictions, and, at times, silent struggles among those who wear white robes. One section of the archive is marked Sub Secreto Pontificio, under papal secrecy. It contains records of discreet confrontations between popes and cardinals, or between former popes and their successors. These documents are never made public while the individuals involved are still alive. They are only archived after those events have passed into history, or after the people in question have left office. A particularly revealing set of files documents the tension between Pope Paul VI and Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, once considered a leading candidate for the papacy. During the Second Vatican Council, Siri vehemently opposed modernizing the Church, from replacing Latin with vernacular languages during Mass to engaging in dialogue with other religions. Internal records show that he wrote privately to Paul, denouncing what he saw as the dismantling of the sacred. The Pope's reply was only 2 lines long, but unmistakably cold. The shepherd cannot wait for the hesitation of the gatekeeper. The disagreements went beyond theology. The Vatican also bore deep fractures in its financial governance. One of the most scandalous and thoroughly documented episodes in the archives is the Vatican Bank crisis involving the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, or IOR, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I still remember holding a thick, typewritten dossier nearly 600 pages long titled Caso Calvi. It refers to the case of Roberto Calvi, an Italian banker found hanged under London's Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. The press called him God's banker due to his close ties to the Vatican Bank. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but the documents preserved in the Vatican archives tell a different story. Inside were bank statements, letters between the IOR and Banco Ambrosiano, records of suspicious loans, and lists of accounts held by front organizations in Panama. A handwritten memo from a bishop voiced a grave concern. We are using sacred assets for activities dangerously close to sin. But the warning was ignored. The files also document internal efforts to reorganize records to prevent legal investigation by Italian authorities. At least 3 documents were labeled da distruggere dopo lettura, to be destroyed after reading. For reasons unknown, they were never destroyed. Equally sensitive is the file on VatiLeaks, the Tutti 12 scandal involving leaked Vatican documents. Many still remember the name Paolo Gabriele, the personal butler of Pope Benedict XV, who copied and smuggled out numerous confidential files. In the archives, a dedicated box preserves the full timeline of the incident, from the internal investigation to Gabriele's handwritten confession. In it, he wrote, "I did not betray the Holy Father. I only wanted the Church to know what was happening behind closed doors." The leaked documents revealed severe internal divisions within the Roman Curia, factions, rival interest groups, and power struggles over influence. Many of the papers exposed financial favoritism, corruption in ecclesiastical appointments, and efforts to suppress scandals involving ethics and criminal behavior. Every line was a fracture in public trust. The fact that the Vatican chose to prosecute Gabriele in an open court was a rare sign that the wall of silence had begun to crack. Once asked a priest who managed the archives, "Why does the Vatican preserve documents that could harm its own reputation?" He smiled, then replied with a sentence I've never forgotten, "Because the truth does not belong to us. It only passes through us." The Vatican archives do not attempt to erase the past. They preserve it, sometimes in silence, sometimes in sorrow, as an unspoken act of accountability. And that, more than any statue of a saint, is what makes this place deeply human. A space where power, faith, and failure are recorded in ink, not in water. There is something few people know. Not every meeting between a head of state and the Pope is publicly announced. To the outside world, the press releases only a few photographs of handshakes and a diplomatic statement about mutual understanding, cooperation, and peace. But in the Vatican archives, I found handwritten records of what was truly said behind closed doors, exchanges that were sometimes blunt, sometimes emotional, occasionally marked by disagreement, and always written carefully, in ink, designed to last a century. One of the most striking files is a record of the meeting between Pope Pius V and Nazi Germany's ambassador to the Holy See, Diego von Bergen, in 1939. This took place just after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia, and tensions with Poland were rising. In the internal note, the Pope did not issue a direct condemnation, but asked pointedly, "Does your government still control the hatred it has sown within German society?" The ambassador did not give a direct answer. The file ends with the remark, "The atmosphere turned markedly cold. There was no closing prayer." A small detail, yet it speaks volumes. Turning to the 1960s, I came across the record of a meeting in 1965 between Pope Paul VI and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. In public, the meeting was hailed as a historic effort to reopen dialogue between East and West, but in the archival transcript, the scribe noted, the Soviet delegation stated that religion is a tool for distorting historical truth. Paul VI responded gently but firmly, "No one can forbid another from believing in the sacred. That is not power. It is part of the human soul." Then, without further comment, he invited the entire delegation to stand in silence for 1 minute in honor of all unknown souls who died for ideals. The Soviet side never mentioned this gesture in any official record. Another notable set of files is simply titled USA Visit Reservate. United States Unpublished Visits. Inside are notes from private meetings between various popes and American presidents, from Roosevelt and Eisenhower to Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush. One entry records a moment from Pope John XXIII's meeting with President John F. Kennedy. In 1963, President Kennedy expressed deep concern over the risk of nuclear conflict following the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Holy Father asked, "Who will remain calm first when the world no longer has a moral foundation to stand on?" Strangely, both men had little time left after that meeting. Pope John XXIII passed away just months later, and Kennedy was assassinated at the end of that same year. The file draws no direct connection, but the proximity of those events led some in the archives to mark it as particularly sensitive. Not only global superpowers are represented in these records. I once came across an old, faded file on a meeting between Pope John Paul II and General Secretary Gorbachev in 1989, just before the Berlin Wall fell. Gorbachev was not religious, but in the meeting record he said, "If we do not change, there will be nothing left to preserve." John Paul II answered with a single line, "Truth rises when people grow weary." After that conversation, the Vatican became one of the first institutions to foresee the unraveling of the Eastern Bloc. Some of the most surprising documents came from smaller nations or countries without long-standing diplomatic ties to the Vatican. In a file marked Vietnam, Colloqui non ufficiali, I found an internal memo from 1991. An unofficial Vatican delegation held talks with representatives of the Vietnamese government in Geneva. No formal agreement, but a willingness was expressed. This was one of the earliest quiet steps toward restoring contact after 1975, not through media headlines, but through handwritten words recorded in silence. The Vatican has no military power and no vast economy, but what I came to understand after reading these records is this. When a world leader seeks sincerity or counsel unburdened by political gain, they come to the Holy See, and the Vatican knows this well. It rarely needs to speak loudly, because every page it preserves has the power to reshape the understanding of an entire generation, if revealed at the right moment. One of the things that sets the Vatican apart from every other religious institution in the world is this. It is not only a church, it is also a sovereign state. It can sign treaties, issue diplomatic communications, and even be sued. And it is within one of the least discussed sections of the Vatican archives, causae juridicae, that I encountered a very different side of the Holy See. In these pages, the language is no longer one of prayer, but of legal argument. Few expect the Vatican, a sacred place, to ever be brought before a court of law. But in reality, since the early 20th century, there have been hundreds of legal disputes involving the Vatican, both internally and with foreign governments. One thick file details the famous legal conflict between the Vatican and the Italian government following the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. The issue was not merely about borders or privileges, but about the ownership of hundreds of buildings, churches, and monasteries across Italy. One memorandum clearly states, "We cannot allow sacred ground to become negotiable property, but neither can we allow it to be nationalized without condition." The negotiations dragged on for years, at times threatening to become a diplomatic crisis. The Vatican had to prove legal ownership of property dating back to the medieval period, often using original documents drawn from these very archives, written in Latin and signed by popes as far back as the 12th century. Thanks to that, many Catholic properties still retain their legal inviolability today. But perhaps the most painful and deeply unsettling documents are those relating to cases of sexual abuse within the Church, which erupted into global public view in the early 2000s. Filed under a sensitive category marked casi disciplinari riservati. Confidential disciplinary cases. I read documents no seminary had ever taught me to expect. One file details an internal investigation from 1962 in a North American diocese. The victim was a minor. The perpetrator was a priest who had already been reported multiple times. But in the memo, the directive from above was clear. Transfer this individual to another parish. Do not make the matter public. Avoid scandal. For the community, no warning was issued to the next congregation. Years later, the same offence occurred again. This was not an isolated case. Similar files appear from Ireland, Germany, Argentina, the Philippines, some of which were never covered by the media. Letters from victims reached the Vatican, sometimes handwritten with trembling script. "I don't know who else will listen. Please don't pretend nothing happened." Some received no reply. Others were labeled for internal review. The Vatican has never denied that abuse occurred, but it approached the issue as an institutional crisis, not simply as a matter of individual crime. Since 2001, the Holy See has implemented stricter disciplinary procedures, and many files document that gradual shift. Yet what silenced me was the agonizing slowness of change. In a 2010 report, one bishop acknowledged, "We were so afraid of scandal that we forgot who it was we were supposed to protect." Beyond abuse cases, the Vatican has also faced numerous international lawsuits over disputed assets, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. One file from 1997 documents a case brought by descendants of Jewish families alleging that the Church held gold and valuables looted by the Nazis. The Vatican denied responsibility, but the file remains archived under unresolved claims. Another highly sensitive case involves the Vatican museums, which house tens of thousands of artifacts from across the globe, including items originating in countries once under colonial rule. In one petition from Peru, the government requested the return of a ceremonial Incan mask. The Vatican responded with a formal statement. This artifact is a record of history. It carries no ownership value, but belongs to the memory of humankind. The matter was left unresolved, like so many others. The archive never offers conclusions. It only preserves evidence. But as you read through hundreds of legal briefs, lawsuits, pleas, and carefully worded replies, you come to understand the Vatican is not removed from the world. It is drawn into it, layer by layer, by the very nature of being human. And when humans err, even in white robes, the paper records remain, impartial, emotionless, but impossible to deny. There is a section within the Vatican archives that even many Catholic scholars have never accessed, not because it is the most heavily guarded, but because it demands a very particular kind of knowledge, Koine Greek, ancient Hebrew, and the Latin of the early Church. This place is informally known as the First Manuscripts Room, a chamber that holds the foundational texts of Christian belief. Ancient Bibles, the earliest translations, and even the writings that were excluded during the formation of the scripture we know today. The first time I entered that section, I hardly dared to breathe, not out of fear, but from a sense of reverence. Standing amidst millennia of handwriting inscribed by hand on animal parchment, with ink made from ash, roots, and the tears of those who believed their words were divine in origin. Tucked inside a worn wooden drawer was a copy of the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving Greek Bibles dating back to the 4th century. Its text is not identical to the printed Bibles we know today. Some passages are missing, others differ in wording, and remarkably, there are entire sections of narrative that no longer appear in the modern canon. A striking example is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Modern versions typically conclude with Jesus appearing to his disciples after the resurrection, but in the Codex Vaticanus that conclusion is absent. The text ends abruptly with the words, "and they were afraid." This has long stirred scholarly debate. Is the widely known ending a later addition? And the Codex is not alone. In a small metal cabinet with 3 locks, I once saw a folder labeled Evangelia Apocrypha, the apocryphal Gospels that were excluded from official scripture. Among them were the Gospels of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip, writings rediscovered at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945, though the Vatican had copies long before. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, consists of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, but arranged without narrative structure. One saying reads, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you." If those words truly came from Christ, they raise deep theological questions about the necessity of the Church as an intermediary between humanity and the divine. Perhaps for this reason such texts were never canonized. Even more controversial is the Acta Pilati, the Acts of Pilate. This document presents the Roman governor's supposed defense after ordering Jesus' crucifixion. In it, Pilate describes Christ as a man unlike any who ever lived, whose eyes shone like fire and whose words flowed like living water. The mythical tone of the account may explain its exclusion from the official New Testament, yet its presence reveals that even Roman officials once tried to make sense of the crucifixion in their own language. Beyond ancient texts, the archives preserve countless letters exchanged between medieval popes and major theologians. Letters that capture intense debates over whether certain books, such as the Revelation of Enoch, the Book of Wisdom, or the Maccabees, should be included in the Bible. In one letter from Pope Damasus III, he wrote, "We do not reject them for falsehood, but because the hearts of men are not yet ready." That sentence has haunted me ever since. How much of Scripture is divine truth, and how much is the result of decisions made under historical pressure? Another record details a closed session of the Council of Nicaea in 325, the first major gathering of Christian bishops from across the Roman Empire to formalize doctrine. The minutes include a list of texts discussed, many of which no longer exist. A side note from a Greek scribe reads, "Certain writings are to be retained for deeper theological study, not for public reading." This suggests they were not destroyed, merely withheld, and may still rest in locked drawers like the ones before me. The archive does not declare what is right or wrong. It remains silent, preserving every interpretation, every variation, every fracture in the history of belief. Some may find that unsettling, but I do not. For what makes faith resilient is not perfect uniformity, but its ability to survive debate, revision, and even doubt. To the outside world, the Pope is a symbol of steadiness, the successor of St. Peter, the embodiment of continuity and unwavering Catholic faith. But within the Vatican archives, behind private files, secret correspondence, and unpublished notes lies something few dare to imagine. The Pope is human. They have feared, doubted, and at times collapsed under the weight of events beyond their control. I still remember the first time I came across a folder titled Lettere non inviate, letters never sent. Inside were handwritten drafts by several popes, never printed, never answered. These were not diplomatic letters nor official decrees. They read like pages from a diary, where men at the height of spiritual authority wrote down what they could not say aloud. One of the most haunting was by Pope Benedict XIII, written in 1917 at the height of the First World War. It was addressed to the leaders of Europe, pleading for a ceasefire so that humanity might not lose its soul entirely to the thunder of artillery. But the letter was never sent. A note in the margin written by the Cardinal Secretary of State at the time read, "No one will listen, and if they do not listen, your holiness will appear weak." The letter was folded and shelved, forgotten, until I stumbled upon it more than a century later. Another file marked Reserve per Conclave, reserved for conclave, contained materials written by some popes for their successors. These documents were never made public, only intended for reading by the College of Cardinals during the papal election. One such memorandum, 12 pages long, was penned by Pope Pius V in 1938, just as the Nazis were consolidating power and anti-Jewish laws were spreading. In that memorandum, the Pope expressed deep concern that parts of the German Church had begun to silently cooperate with the fascist regime. He warned, if we remain silent, history will not speak of our wisdom, it will speak of our complicity. That document was never read. Pius V died shortly before he could issue a public encyclical condemning anti-Semitism. The memorandum remained in the archive, sealed and silent. One file left me standing motionless for a long time. It held records about Pope John Paul I, who served only 33 days before his sudden death. Many conspiracy theories have swirled around that event, but in the archives there was no intrigue, only the cold truth of internal memos showing that the Pope had been preparing a sweeping reform of the Vatican's financial administration, including changes to the Vatican Bank and a review of secret accounts linked to Italian financial institutions. In one of his handwritten notes he wrote, "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." That line was underlined 3 times, but he never had the chance to act. And in a meeting record held shortly after his death, one cardinal wrote, "We must continue the mission, but we must not touch the structural foundations." That sentence has echoed in my mind ever since. Even beloved popes like John Paul II and Francis have left behind handwritten letters heavy with emotion. One unpublished draft by John Paul II, written during the height of the abuse scandal, shows clear inner conflict. "I do not know if I have done enough. Every night I pray not only for forgiveness from God, but from the victims I have never met." His handwriting was simple, but the words were weighty, like the papal tiara he wore for over 2 decades. Pope Francis, known for his closeness and reformist spirit, also has letters never made public. One was addressed to a cardinal convicted of abuse, in which he wrote, "The sin of an individual does not destroy the Church, but the covering up does." An attached memo revealed that fierce internal debate continues within the Vatican over the boundaries of forgiveness and transparency in the modern age. The Vatican archives never speak aloud, but its pages, yellowed, trembling, and never seen by the public, carry what no press release could ever convey: that beneath The glow of authority, the chair of Peter, is also a solitary journey, and even the head of the church has sleepless nights, just like any other soul in the world. When people speak of the Vatican, they think of churches, rituals, and faith, but few think of telegrams, or intelligence reports, or financial contracts with foreign banks. And yet it is precisely these seemingly secular elements that occupy a considerable part of the deepest layers of the Vatican archives, where the Holy See's unofficial ties with worldly powers have been recorded, line by line. One of the first folders that left me stunned bore the title Contatti Riservati, Intelligence. It contains documents detailing secret communications between the Vatican and Western intelligence agencies during the Cold War, particularly with the CIA and MI6. In one memo dated June 17, 1953, just weeks after the coup in Iran, a CIA representative in Rome met with a Vatican cardinal to discuss anti-communist developments in the Middle East. The report was brief. The Holy See is morally supportive, will not intervene directly, but is willing to encourage local churches to promote democratic values in opposition to atheism. No formal agreement was signed, but the message was clear. The Vatican was not merely observing the world, it had the moral stature to influence the flow of ideologies, especially through faith. Another memo from 1979 records a secret meeting between a CIA operative and Vatican officials shortly before Pope John Paul II's visit to his homeland in Poland. The CIA expressed particular interest in whether the Polish Pope could inspire the Solidarity movement. The Vatican made no promises, but the memo noted, "We are aware of our role, but the gospel is not a strategic tool." A diplomatic response, neither agreeing nor denying, yet leaving room for silent action. Another set of files labeled Relazioni Riservate Israele, documents clandestine contacts between the Vatican and Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. The correspondence includes Vatican requests for the protection of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem amid escalating tensions between Jews and Palestinians. A Mossad report sent back to the Vatican stated, "We do not care about the religion of the person standing in a sanctuary so long as they are not hiding weapons." The Vatican's reply was terse but telling. "We do not hide weapons. We preserve memory." The next layer I encountered had nothing to do with espionage, but with finance. A folder titled Banca e Potere, Banking and Power, chronicled the Vatican's relationships with numerous international financial institutions, including Banco Ambrosiano, UBS of Switzerland, and financial entities in Panama. The Kit files contain wire transfer records and investments in real estate across London, Paris, and even resort properties in South America. An internal report from 1985 notes, "A portion of investment returns will be redirected to the charitable funds of the Holy See. No public disclosure required." The concern was not that the Vatican was investing, but that it used shell companies to avoid scrutiny. Some accounts were listed under the names of pastoral foundations, but managed by financial directors of private banks. There were no signs of abuse, but the structure was so opaque that tracing funds was nearly impossible. And perhaps that was precisely the intent. What surprised me even more was a small, unnumbered, unstamped folder bearing only a handwritten title, Rapporti non ufficiali Fraternità Riservate. This was a record of confidential encounters between high-ranking Vatican officials and representatives of Western secret societies, including the Freemasons, a group long condemned by the Catholic Church. One memo dated 1969 records a bishop in Switzerland meeting with a senior Freemason of the European Lodge to explore possibilities for dialogue on human rights and freedom of conscience. no conclusions were reached. But notably, Vatican policy began to shift thereafter, from outright prohibition to a more cautious stance of discouraging participation, creating a grey area in doctrine and allowing for interfaith dialogue with groups once branded as heretical. I found no evidence of conspiracy or Vatican manipulation of world events, but I saw clearly the Vatican does not live in isolation. It maintains a network, not declared, not publicized, but quietly active for centuries, and its archives preserve every handshake, every letter, every unofficial meeting, as if history does not happen on stage, but in the wings behind the curtain. When one enters the Vatican, the first thing they usually notice is the light, from the stained glass windows, from the gilded brilliance of the Sistine Chapel, from the flickering candles and shimmering statues in the grand basilicas. But few are aware that alongside that light there exists another realm, one of silence, condensation, and ritual so intricate it borders on the mystical. And in the Vatican archives, what unsettled me most wasn't political documentation, but the rituals themselves. These are manuscripts that have never left the stone walls, read aloud only once, then locked away behind drawers with 3 brass latches. One of the most astonishing documents I encountered was a handwritten manual titled Ordo Rituum Conclavis, over 80 pages detailing the precise sequence of steps in organizing the papal conclave. The original may not be copied or publicly released. It is not merely a description, but it is a living document containing whispered prayers, sealing rituals, and even coded signals used among officials to ensure no information escapes. A particularly striking section records the oath of the ceremoniere, segreto, the secret master of ceremonies tasked with upholding absolute silence during the conclave. The oath itself is not fully written, showing only its opening line. I swear, before God and the shadow of St. Peter. The rest is transcribed in abbreviated Latin code, intelligible only to the inner circle. A note in the margin reads, "Should the oath be broken, every prayer within the sanctuary will lose its virtue." Whether symbolic or literal, the gravity of that sentence was impossible to ignore. Another document I came across was labeled, "To be used only when there is no pope, Ordo Exequiae Pontificis Maximi," the internal protocol following the death of a pontiff. It details every moment, from who is allowed to enter the papal chambers first, who seals the doors, to the sequence for public announcement. One passage in particular sent chills through me. Before announcing to the world, the Camerlengo shall call the Pope's name 3 times in Latin through the closed door. If no response is heard, he shall declare the Holy Father deceased. It is not merely a ritual, it is the final symbol of both authority and mortality. I also came across a short manual reserved for a rare event, Canonizzazione Extraordinaria, the extraordinary canonization of a saint outside the usual process. Only 8 pages long, it contains strange prescriptions. The relic must be a non-decomposable element. The ceremony must last precisely 3 hours. No more, no less. And the individual who proclaims the title must have a blood or spiritual bond with the saint's community. Whether these rules are still enforced is unclear, but the document remains untouched. One of the least known files was titled De Symbolis Non Publicis, on non-public symbols. It catalogues the secret symbols, items, and colors used by the Vatican in urgent or exceptional situations. For example, a red cord diagonally tied across a Vatican chamber signifies that the room is undergoing theological deliberation, meaning a doctrinal crisis is under discussion. Or a bottle of deep brown ink, known as ink of silence, is used only to write texts that will never be made public. Each symbol is accompanied by explanations in archaic Latin, understood only by the highest clergy. But what haunted me most was a thin, black, leather-bound book without a title, marked only with a date. dhruv MCMXLV, April 3rd, 1945. Inside was a ritual never enacted, prepared for the scenario in which Rome fell into the hands of fascist forces or the Soviet Red Army. It outlined how to seal holy relics, how to destroy sensitive documents, and described a rite called Benedictio Ultima, the final blessing, to be performed only if Vatican sovereignty were completely lost. No one has read that blessing aloud since it was written. But it remains there, in the shadows, waiting for a moment the world prays never arrives. The Vatican is a state, but it is also a ceremony. And within its archives, ritual is not merely an action, it is the language of memory. Every written prayer, every crimson seal, every phrase spoken only once in centuries, they are all essential parts of this structure. Not out of superstition, but out of the belief that in a world that changes by the day, some things must be preserved, if only to remind us that we once believed in something eternal. In a quiet corridor tucked away in the northern basement of the Vatican archives, I stumbled upon an old wooden box carved with a single word: Index. There was no seal, no guide. But inside lay a long and fraught history, the tension between knowledge and faith preserved in full by the Vatican, every book title, every reason for prohibition, every internal debate that never reached the public eye. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or List of Prohibited Books, was officially established in 1559 by Pope Paul IV at the height of the Counter-Reformation. It became the most powerful instrument of censorship the Holy See ever wielded for over 4 centuries. But what lies preserved in the archives is not just a list, it is the process, the deliberations, the heated arguments, and, at times, the deep contradictions among theologians, clergy, and even the popes themselves. In my hands, I held a yellowed, typewritten record from 1907, the minutes of a meeting of the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Fidei, the office charged with safeguarding doctrine. In it, members debated whether to add historian Ernst Renan's Vie de Jésus, the life of Jesus, to the index. Some argued Renan blasphemed by portraying Jesus as a mere historical figure, not divine. But one bishop opposed the ban, saying, "If we forbid him, we acknowledge his influence." The book was ultimately banned, but the argument remains preserved, revealing how censorship within the Church was not always unanimous, but often a struggle between the defense of faith and the demands of the modern age. Another file, nearly 300 pages long, was labelled with a single line, Galileo Galilei Aggiornamenti. It contains every document tied to Galileo's trial, not only the sentence but also handwritten pleas for leniency, notes from bishops who opposed his condemnation, and letters from later generations, including Pope John Paul II's formal acknowledgement of the Church's mistake in 1992. One record from 1633 reads, "We do not condemn science. We condemn the arrogance that seeks to rise above revelation." That sentence still echoes, especially today, as scientific theories once deemed dangerous, evolution, the Big Bang, are now accepted by the Vatican as not incompatible with faith. Beyond books, the Church once maintained a specific body focused on art and media, which I later discovered had its own file titled Cinema e Fede. This section contains evaluations of films screened in Catholic countries from the 1920s through the 1980s. Some entries were unusual A review of Fellini's La Dolce Vita noted, excessively secular, but accurately portrays the emptiness of a world without God. The conclusion, banned from Catholic schools but not publicly condemned, because a loud ban would only increase its appeal. Another folder records the Church's response to philosophical or allegorical literature. It includes a discussion of George Orwell's 1984, which some suspected of critiquing religious totalitarianism, but internal documents concluded this is a condemnation of secular totalitarianism, no response necessary. It reveals that Vatican censors were often subtle analysts, not reactionary, but selective in their battles. Perhaps the most intriguing file was marked internal circulation only, do not reproduce, detailing the Vatican's internal review of the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Though many clergy denounced the book in public, internal reports stated its impact lies in exploiting the public's ignorance of religious rituals and symbols. The best response is not condemnation, but education. Rather than banning the book, the Vatican responded with a series of counter-publications, a strategic shift from censorship to engagement. The index was officially abolished in 1966, but the files remain. Quiet, untouched, lined up on Vatican shelves like a reminder the greatest power lies not in prohibition, but in shaping how and when people receive an idea. And for centuries, the Vatican has not merely safeguarded the faith, it has shaped the threshold of knowledge, deciding how far it should open, when, and to whom. When I stepped into the section labelled Cruciata, an uncanny silence fell over everything around me. Gone were the 20th century maps, the diplomatic telegrams, the polished dossiers between envoys. What remained were parchment scrolls, black ink, and red wax seals once pressed between the fingers of the most powerful men in Europe. This was where the Vatican kept what remained from a time when faith was transformed into war. The Crusades, carried out in the name of holiness, but leaving behind stains of blood on the map of history that no prayer could erase. One of the first documents I found was the original crusading bull of 1095, Deus Vult, issued by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont. Written in Latin, it begins with an urgent plea. The Holy Land has been seized. The blood of the faithful cries from Jerusalem. The Catholic must march. There is no political agenda, no mention of land or wealth, only a call to arms. And yet that call ignited more than 2 centuries of continuous warfare and claimed the lives of millions under the shadow of the cross. Subsequent documents, especially from the time of Pope Innocent III, show how the Crusades evolved into a structured campaign, no longer merely a spiritual appeal, but a logistical operation involving taxes, recruitment, supply chains, and rewards. I read letters between the Vatican and European lords discussing the number of knights, provisions, and, most troubling, the right to seize the property of those who refused to convert or join the cause. A particularly striking document, dated 1204, records the Vatican's internal reaction to the Fourth Crusade, which instead of reaching Jerusalem, sacked Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Orthodoxy. In the minutes penned by Cardinal Pietro Capuano, there's a chilling admission. We let the sword lead, not the spirit. We did not conquer heresy. We looted our brethren. Though Pope Innocent III issued a formal, restrained condemnation of the pillage, no reparations or apologies ever followed. But what haunted me most were not the wartime documents, but the post-war ones. A file titled Requiem pro Errore, a prayer for the error, preserves the Vatican's reflections and acknowledgements of the past. Inside was an unpublished speech draft by Pope Paul VI, meant to be delivered during his 1960 visit to Istanbul. It reads, "We brought war into places that once knelt in prayer. We cannot claim this was God's will." The speech was withdrawn at the last moment and replaced with a more neutral address, but the original remains here, beneath layers of dust. The Vatican archives also preserve lesser-known crusades, the Northern Crusades against pagans in the Baltics, the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, aimed at annihilating the Cathars, and even campaigns against disobedient Catholic monarchs. A record from the 13th century documents a bishop who refused to join a crusade, stating, "I do not see God in fire and blood." He was stripped of his office shortly thereafter. Still, the archives also bear witness to later efforts of dialogue and reconciliation. A folder titled Reconciliazioni holds correspondence between the Holy See and the Orthodox churches of Russia, Greece, and Armenia, communities still scarred by the Crusades. In a letter from 1999, Pope John Paul II wrote to Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew VI, "If blood once divided us, let prayer begin to mend the wounds that history left behind. It wasn't a public apology, but it was a beginning." In all these documents, I did not find an evil or ruthless Vatican, but I did see an institution that once wielded faith as a justification for war, and that slowly, over centuries, learned to reflect on itself. None of these texts deny the past, but they do not whitewash the present either. The Vatican archives do not seek to justify. They preserve these with a solemn fidelity to memory, and with the belief that truth, however bitter, is an essential part of redemption. One quiet rainy afternoon, while I was searching for documents related to medieval church councils, an elderly archivist pointed toward a small, solitary wooden box at the end of the shelf and said, "You should read this. This is where the Church keeps what it never declared, yet never discarded." Because even they knew some women once helped lay the very foundation of faith. The box had no name, only a catalogue number and a handwritten note, "Mulieres in silentio ecclesiae," women in the silence of the church. Inside was not a large trove of documents, but one that contained a quiet, persistent current of history the Vatican has never officially acknowledged, not because it was rebellious, but because it raised a question still unresolved. What is the true place of women in a faith structure ruled almost exclusively by men for nearly 2 millennia? I began with a set of handwritten letters from the 12th century by Hildegard von Bingen, a German nun, composer, theologian, and visionary. Most of her writings, in Latin and Old German, recorded spiritual visions of profound theological and philosophical depth. In one letter to Pope Eugenius III, Hildegard wrote, "The soul of a woman is also breathed into being by God, so why must her voice pass only through the mouths of men?" Remarkably, the letter was not answered with condemnation, but with silence. A silence calculated and deliberate. Still, Hildegard was not branded a heretic. On the contrary, several voices within the Roman Curia praised her, but kept her at a distance. In one internal record, I found the line, "This woman is not wrong, but the Church cannot yet permit women to teach from the pulpit." Her intellect was recognized, yet an invisible line remained, one she and countless others were never allowed to cross. Digging deeper, I found another file titled Monialium Scripturae, Writings of the Nuns. It was a collection of prayers, poems, and liturgical texts composed by women in religious orders from the 9th to 16th centuries. Among them were prayers both graceful and defiant. "I do not ask to be priest, I ask to tend the flame unseen, burning quietly in the darkest chapel corner. These words were never spoken in formal rites, but they were copied by hand, passed from nun to nun, their brown-black ink still visible on parchment softened by time. The most haunting section, however, was the file on heresy investigations, particularly those targeting women whose spiritual influence grew too large. A 1321 case from southern France recorded the trial of a group of women accused of unauthorized preaching, though they had only held Bible readings and shared personal interpretations. One interrogation transcript reads, "Do you believe women can interpret the Word of God?" The woman, named Clara, replied, "If God chose a virgin to bear him, why would he not choose her tongue to proclaim him?" The record ends. She was burned at the stake, and yet not all voices were silenced. In the files from the Second Vatican Council, I found letters and internal minutes documenting serious discussions on expanding women's roles in the modern Church. A handwritten note from Cardinal Suinens read, "It is not enough to bring more women into the Church. We must admit they have always been here." From 1965 onward, Vatican commissions began including women as theological advisors, but, as one document explicitly stated, consultano non decidono, they may advise, but they do not decide. More recently, I came across minutes from a 2016 meeting discussing the possibility of female deacons. A group of female theologians presented historical evidence that deaconesses were recognized in the 1st to 3rd centuries in early Christian Greek texts. One cardinal pushed back. That was not the same as ordination today. But another, whose name was redacted in the version I read, wrote, "If a truth must be hidden because our current structure cannot contain it, then the fault is not in the truth." That sentence made me sit in silence for a long time. The Vatican Archives did not erase these women, but it has never placed them in the light. They remain like slanted footnotes in the margins of history, not loud enough to echo from pulpits, but strong enough to withstand the winds of time. And as I closed that wooden box, I understood the Church was not built only of stone and men. It was built with the hands of women who laundered vestments, copied sacred texts, raised believers, and in silence carried the flame of faith through its darkest centuries. The Vatican is often seen as a moral haven, a symbol of faith and forgiveness. But the truth is, wherever there are humans, there are mistakes. And within the ancient stone walls surrounding St. Peter's Square, those mistakes don't always come from the outside. Sometimes they come from within. In a section of the Vatican Archives marked Delicta Reservata, reserved crimes, I began exploring a series of case files sealed away for decades. There was nothing mystical about them. No curses, no dark conspiracies, only paperwork, signatures, and chillingly meticulous transcripts, records of criminal acts committed within the very institution that preaches grace and virtue. One of the earliest files I encountered was a theft in 1969 from the Sacred Relics Repository, the chamber where hundreds of holy artifacts were stored, including saintly bones, martyrs' robes, and handwritten scriptures from early Christianity. According to the report, a young monk assigned to clean the vault secretly took a small box believed to contain relics of St. Lawrence. He didn't try to sell it. Instead, he kept it in his room, claiming he could hear the saint whisper. In dreams, the Vatican held a closed trial. No journalists, no announcements. The verdict: no criminal prosecution, but the monk was laicized and permanently expelled from Vatican territory. A note attached read, "This action stemmed from misdirected faith, not greed." Perhaps that was why mercy prevailed. Another case, far more serious, occurred in 1982, the murder of a teenage boy of Vatican citizenship inside the Vatican gardens, mere meters from the Pope's office. The case file, labelled Caso AG82, revealed the victim was the son of a Vatican Treasury employee. His body was found near the southern wall with evidence of blunt trauma to the head. The prime suspect, a gatekeeper with a history of mental instability. The internal investigation spanned over 400 pages, detailing every step of interrogation and examination. The suspect was described as having lost control due to religious anxiety and psychological isolation. Yet instead of being handed over to Italian authorities, the Vatican dealt with it internally. He was confined to a secluded monastic facility, cut off from the outside world, and never faced public trial. The final line of the report reads, "The peace of the faithful must be preserved more than the curiosity of the crowd." The Vatican operates under its own legal system, based on the Codex Juris Canonici, or canon law. But since the 1929 Lateran Treaty, it has also selectively adopted parts of Italian law, especially in severe criminal cases. Still, jurisdiction remains with Vatican courts, where judges are typically high-ranking clergy or cardinals. In the archives, I came across a list of judges from 1929 to the present, names that appear nowhere in public records, yet wield enormous authority in cases that could shake the Church's moral foundation. Another notable file pertained to suspected money laundering involving the Vatican Bank during 2009-2011. Though touched upon by the press, the documents I saw contained internal account records and transcripts from confidential meetings between bishops and financial advisors. A 2010 report stated plainly there was negligence in monitoring transfers from the Opus account to a bank in Liechtenstein. No formal charges were ever filed, but shortly thereafter the bank's director resigned. No press release, no press conference, just a single note in the minutes of his final meeting. "We choose to carry the wound rather than expose it to public carving." One of the most haunting cases, and perhaps the most shrouded in mystery, remains that of Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old girl and Vatican citizen who disappeared in 1983. Her case has persisted for decades, spawning countless theories involving the Italian mafia, political plots, and Vatican cover-ups. Inside the archives, the related file is labelled Riservatissimo, top secret. I was only permitted to see a handful of pages dated 1985, including a memo stating that the Vatican received an anonymous letter claiming Emanuela was alive and being held for political negotiation. There was no official response. One cardinal wrote, "If the claim is false, replying invites chaos. If true, silence is our last hope." And so the Vatican chose silence. For 40 years. The archives is not a courtroom, but it is where the unspoken judgments are kept, not always to conceal, but because in a place as small and symbolically immense as the Vatican, every sin becomes systemic. Every failing is not just a personal fall, but a crack in the moral foundation shared by millions, and so the Vatican chooses to handle such matters in shadow, quietly, with law, but without light. If the Vatican is a treasury of faith, then art is the golden key that unlocks the deepest layers of the human spirit. The frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the marble sculptures, the stained glass windows that narrate the scriptures, through image all have become etched in the memory of humankind. But what few realize is this. Some works of art, sketches, studies, even completed paintings, have never been seen by the public. They remain in silence, hidden within the vaults of the Vatican. One misty morning, I was led down into a quiet, basement tucked behind the Vatican museums, a space never included in any guided tour. Beyond 3 iron doors, I found a small vault called Deposito Pittorico Riservato, the reserved painting repository. Here are housed artworks that have not yet been evaluated, have never been displayed, or have been withheld for being incompatible with current theological direction. No one says this aloud, but what I saw inside will stay with me forever. The first rack I approached held an unpublished sketch by Michelangelo, a charcoal figure drawn on darkened paper, reaching out in pain and longing. It resembled the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. But instead of receiving light from God, the figure was surrounded by darkness. A handwritten note beneath the drawing read, "Non è destinato alla cappella, troppo umano." Not intended for the chapel, too human. I wondered, what made a Michelangelo drawing unworthy of the Vatican's walls? Perhaps it expressed something theology fears to face, that humanity is not only a creature to be redeemed, but also one abandoned to despair, not always reaching toward the light. On another shelf were 2 oil paintings signed by Raphael Sanzio, though his signature had been faded over in grey ink. An accompanying study noted that the style of these works was too worldly for the rest of his known body. One depicted a pregnant woman holding a crucifix, a striking image deemed theologically inconsistent, since the Virgin Mary is never portrayed this way. A small annotation beneath read, "Confusione dottrinale," may cause doctrinal confusion, and so a masterpiece was veiled not because it lacked beauty, but because it raised questions. I also came across a painting attributed to Caravaggio, never put on display. It showed St. Peter, not yet an apostle, as a humble fisherman, dirt on his face, gripping a torn fishing net. No divine light, no halo, no sacred symbol, just a tired man at the beginning of faith. Was that why it was withheld? Because it lacked the sanctified image of a purified saint, or because it felt too real? A different folder labeled Iconographia, Contestata, Contested Iconography, listed artworks that had been requested to be removed, covered, or never reproduced. Among them were sculptures of the Virgin Mary portrayed in African and Asian features, created by local artisans during missionary periods. A 1911 Vatican Cultural Council memo noted, "Diversity is part of divine creation, but uniformity is necessary to preserve sanctity." Under that logic, many such statues were never placed upon altars. There was even a special section dedicated to modern art, documenting Vatican decisions to decline exhibitions or collaborations with major artists like Salvador Dalí, Francis Bacon, or Ai Weiwei. A 1950 internal document revealed Dalí had proposed a series of surreal revelations of the saints. Vatican officials responded, "We cannot allow sacred imagery to become obscure visual metaphor." But the Vatican does not destroy these works. Quite the opposite. They preserve them carefully, document each crack, each brushstroke, each layer of pigment, and yet they choose to keep them hidden. Not because the art lacks value, but because in the blinding clarity of theology, what is too human, too raw, too unfinished, may shake a faith that relies on certainty. When I left that vault, I didn't carry images of angels or crucifixes. I remembered only the eyes covered in dust, the eyes of paintings never seen. And I wondered, perhaps what the Vatican withholds from the world is not out of fear of losing belief, but fear of confronting a version of faith still in progress, where saints and sinners, heaven and earth, are still in debate, still unfinished on the canvas. When people think of the Vatican, they think of chapels, prayers, theology, not telescopes. And yet between faith and the cosmos lies a quiet path, often overlooked. The Vatican is home to one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. And within its archives, what's preserved is not just star charts, but a long, intimate history of tension and harmony between heaven and earth, between belief and intellect. My journey began at a small filing cabinet labelled Specula Vaticana, the official name of the Vatican Observatory. Inside were handwritten records from the 17th to the 20th century, notes on comet sightings, solar eclipses, and strange stars appearing in the night sky. One notebook dated 1610, copied from the original records of Christopher Clavius, the Jesuit astronomer who helped design the modern Gregorian calendar, reads, "The stars are not disorder. They are signs of an order we do not yet understand." In that line, I saw something deeply revealing. The Vatican never truly turned its back on science. It simply chose its own terms of engagement. Another cabinet held documents not of condemnation, but of internal scientific debate regarding the Galileo affair. I found a 36-page report from 1616, written by a group of clerics trained in mathematics and astronomy, seeking to argue that a stationary Earth was natural and in harmony with Scripture. Yet in a margin note, a young priest quietly asked, "Should we not question why Scripture is silent on centrifugal force?" The question was never raised in court, but it was kept. As if the Vatican knew not all doubts are heresy, then I found a document never publicly released, a handwritten draft by Pope Benedict XIV, dated 1741, calling for the rehabilitation of Galileo's name. It was never officially published, yet the Vatican kept it, perhaps because some acts of redemption don't require proclamations, only a reader in silence. By the 20th century, the Vatican's files grew to include international scientific collaboration. A folder from 1935 recorded the Vatican's sponsorship of an expedition to Africa to observe a total solar eclipse. In a letter back to Rome, the expedition leader wrote, "Faith does not prevent us from measuring darkness. It is because we believe in divine order that we dare to quantify the vanishing of light." Another document from 1981 described a private symposium in the Vatican between theologians and quantum physicists. One Swiss professor presented the multiverse hypothesis. The reaction was not rejection. The minutes noted, if God is infinite, the universe need not be singular. A rare statement, but a sign that the Vatican had quietly evolved, no longer a guardian of fixed truths, but a house in dialogue with the ever-widening edges of understanding. I even found correspondence between the Vatican and NASA, particularly around the time humanity prepared to set foot on the moon. A handwritten letter from the Holy See to President Kennedy, dated 1962, read, "We pray for those who dare to leave Adam's sky to witness the Creator's work from without." When Apollo 11 succeeded, the Vatican did not hold public celebrations, but in Pope Paul VI's private journal, one line was recorded, "Today man does not merely gaze upon the heavens, he has touched them." To my astonishment, I also found a copy of a letter from Stephen Hawking to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences dated 1990. In it he questioned whether God was even necessary in cosmological origins. The Vatican didn't rebut. A theologian wrote in a confidential note, "If God must hide in the gaps of equations, then he is not truly eternal." That admission, never made public, said more to me than 1,000 sermons. Faith, when genuine, does not fear challenge. Today, the Vatican Observatory still operates quietly from Castel Gandolfo. They make no loud declarations. They do not argue with modern science. But in their archives I saw something even more profound. A faith that does not extinguish reason, but constantly dares it to its furthest boundary, so that when the last starlight fades, something immeasurable may still remain. One late afternoon, as sunlight from the dome of St. Peter's Basilica slanted into the lowest levels of the Vatican archives, I opened a drawer marked Res Diplomaticae ex Oriente et Borea. Diplomatic records from the East and the North. Inside were not treaties of the European kind, not pacts with Catholic kingdoms, but a series of letters, messages, and transcripts of contact between the Vatican and vast empires that did not share the Christian faith, where belief did not align. But power still demanded dialogue. I began with a dossier from the 16th century detailing the early exchanges between the Vatican and the Ottoman Empire. A letter dated 1584, sent by Sultan Murad III to Pope Gregory XIII, was written in Ottomani, Turkish, accompanied by a Latin translation. In it, the Sultan addressed the Pope as leader of the believers in the triune God and proposed a commercial pact to ensure mutual respect for sacred territories. The Vatican's reply did not reject the proposal. When peace opens the path to prayer, there is no need for the sword of faith. A strange tone, cautious, yet yearning for a shared order between two civilizations, long portrayed as irreconcilable. In another folder from 1713, I found the transcript of a secret meeting between a Vatican envoy and representatives of the Qing dynasty held in Macau. It recorded the Holy See's concern over Emperor Kangxi's decree banning Christianity following the rights controversy. The internal note read, "The court does not reject faith, but rejects the denial of Chinese rights. We may withdraw the decree if it does not harm sacred doctrine." No agreement was reached, but the dialogue itself revealed that the Vatican had come to recognize bringing faith into another culture required humility, not dogma. What struck me most was a never declassified file titled Negotiationes cum Moscovia. It contained records of secret efforts from the 17th to the 19th centuries to establish relations between the Vatican and the Russian Tsars. In a memo from 1860, the Vatican noted that the Russian Orthodox Church had become the arm of imperial authority, and that without dialogue, reconciliation between the churches would remain impossible. A private letter from Pope Pius IX to Tsar Alexander II included the line, "When the throne seeks eternity, it must listen to the voice of the eternal throne." There was no reply, but the Vatican did not stop writing. In a document from 1902, the Vatican recorded contact with a Japanese scholar representing the Meiji court. The two parties discussed theology, culture, and the possibility of coexistence between Christian charity and the honor of Shinto. One line in the transcript stood out: "The East does not reject faith, it rejects imposition." It read like a reminder to the Church itself. Truth is not a gift that can be forced upon another. I found a 1954 internal memo, just after the end of the First Indochina War, in which the Vatican proposed sending a secret envoy to northern Vietnam to observe the condition of Catholics following the Geneva Accords. There was no official order, no public document, but in the file the envoy's handwritten note read, "I saw priests celebrating Mass in silence, vestments hidden under civilian clothes. Faith here makes no noise, but it has never died." The report was never published. One of the most moving files was a compilation titled Via Pacis, The Path of Peace, containing the full correspondence between the Vatican and the United Nations from the end of World War II to the present. In a 1965 note, when the Vatican became a permanent observer, a cardinal wrote, "The Church has no army, no vote, but it may still whisper into the conscience of the world." That line remains true, though today the world hears those whispers less clearly than before. None of these records boast of influence. On the contrary, they show a Vatican often in the weaker position, the one initiating contact, the one seeking common ground, the one striving to understand its interlocutor. In the shadows of geopolitical power, the Vatican was never a superpower, but it held another weapon: time. The Vatican knows how to wait. And when it waits long enough, dynasties collapse, revolutions burn out, and the Holy See continues to write letters, preserving even the replies that were never sent. When people hear the word miracle, they often picture radiant light, weeping statues, or celestial hymns echoing from the heavens. But when I first stepped into the section labeled Supernaturalis Recensio, Review of Supernatural Phenomena, I saw no light, smelled no incense, heard no sacred sound. I saw documents, thousands of pages of reports, black and white photographs, audio recordings, medical transcripts, and long columns of clinical analysis, all filed meticulously, like a crime scene investigation room. The first file I opened concerned the famous event of Fatima, the apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Portugal in 1917, still remembered as a miracle. But what the Vatican preserved most carefully was not the content of the visions, but the process of verification. A memorandum dated October 26, 1930, sent by the Archbishop of Leiria to the Holy See, noted, "We interviewed more than 60 witnesses, photographed the sun during the foretold times, yet detected no optical distortion in the cameras. However, descriptions by the locals were remarkably consistent regarding the movement of light. The Vatican did not deny it, but neither did it proclaim a miracle. Instead, it recorded, by theological and pastoral criteria, the event is acceptable for devotion, but not binding for belief." That same conclusion appears repeatedly across the archive's records of apparitions, never a denial, but always a careful distance. Another case was that of Lourdes, France, in 1858, where the young Bernadette Soubirous claimed to see the Virgin Mary multiple times in a grotto. The Vatican's file preserved detailed transcripts of every interrogation, from local doctors to senior clergy. One line in the document read, "The girl displays no signs of hallucination, yet the figure she describes does not match doctrinal conceptions of the Virgin at the time." Eventually, the Church did not validate the visions directly, but rather the inexplicable recoveries from illness that followed pilgrimages to Lourdes, and the Vatican never rushed. In another file, I read about the 1973 apparitions in Akita, Japan, which were not officially recognized by the Holy See until over 20 years of investigation had passed. Doctors, psychologists, theologians were dispatched, and each step was accompanied by internal reports. One particularly telling note read, "The weeping statue of the Virgin is chemically verifiable, but scientifically inexplicable." This does not make it a miracle, it makes it worthy of monitoring. Then I found a striking registry called Causae Rejectae, rejected cases. In it were hundreds of reports deemed fabricated, exaggerated, or lacking supernatural merit. There were photographs of statues dripping water due to plumbing leaks, audio recordings traced to human manipulation, witnesses who later retracted their claims. In one Latin American case, the supposed visionary confessed to having been paid by a pilgrimage group. The Vatican report simply stated, "Secular motivation, file closed." Another part of the archive held cases of unexplained healings. The Vatican maintains an independent medical panel called Consulta Medica, which evaluates every supposed miraculous recovery. One file from 2002 described a Parkinson's patient who fully recovered after praying to Blessed John Paul II. The attending physician confirmed it. Still, the Vatican noted 5 additional years of observation required to rule out natural remission. No haste, no sentimentality, just a process as rigorous as any clinical trial. One small file I stumbled upon bore the name Aurora Messina, a 17-year-old girl in Italy who in 1966 claimed to receive nightly divine prophecies during full moons. Crowds gathered at her home, but internal Vatican notes stated, after 7 months of observation, no objective evidence was found. The divine voice in her room was ultimately traced to a hidden speaker installed under her bed by her brother, who later confessed he only wanted to protect the faith of the villagers. The case was sealed with a red stamp. Deception for notoriety. But perhaps the most haunting file was one without a date, titled Lux Inter Cecos, Light Among the Blind. It contained a testimony by an elderly priest living in a mountain monastery in Switzerland. He claimed to have seen a glowing child in the snow one night, but when he approached, it vanished. He did not ask for recognition. He simply asked the Holy See to record his account, so that if anyone else ever sees it, they will not think themselves mad. The Vatican neither rejected nor affirmed it. One line from the examiner's note read, "Silence is the only way to preserve the sacred." The Vatican does not chase wonders. It observes, it doubts, it measures every tear from a statue, every unexplained light, every whispered prayer in the fields. And in that silence, it chooses to preserve what it does not yet understand, not to display, but to remind itself that if God truly reveals himself, he will not need trumpet blasts or headlines. He will arrive in moments no one expects and no one hears, except for those patient enough to wait, as the Vatican has done for centuries. I never meant to seek out the prophecy of St. Malachy. For many within the Vatican, that name evokes more discomfort than reverence. Yet one day, while I was researching documents related to early 17th century councils, I stumbled upon a thin file tucked inside an unrelated dossier. Its cover was marked simply De Prophetia Malachiae, unpublished version. Inside was a handwritten copy dated 1595. The same year the prophecy was first printed in Rome by Father Arnold de Wyon in his work Lignum Vitae. The reason the Vatican preserved this manuscript was not out of belief, but to monitor how it spread. A margin note by Cardinal Baronius read, "The people are enamored with this prophecy as if it were a fifth gospel, but faith built upon fear is not faith." The prophecy of St. Malachy is said to have been written by the Irish Archbishop Malachy O'Morgair during a pilgrimage to Rome in 1139. In it, he listed 112 Latin mottos, each meant to correspond to a future pope from Celestine II up to the very last, who, it is said, would witness the fall of the Holy City and the Day of Judgment. In the Vatican archives, I found an internal table, never made public, mapping each prophetic phrase to an actual pontiff. Some were eerily accurate. Lumen in Caelo, light in the sky, was linked to Pope Leo XIII, whose coat of arms bore a radiant star. Pastor Angelicus, the angelic shepherd, fit Pius X, revered for his spiritual life. But the further down the list, the weaker the connections. Ultimately, a Vatican memo from 1978 concluded, "This is the effect of reading backward. People assign meaning to what has already passed, not what is to come." Still, what prevented the Vatican from outright denouncing the prophecy was the final line. In Persecution Extrema SRA, sedebit Petrus Romanus. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman shall sit upon the throne, and then the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. Then came 2013, Pope Benedict XVI resigned. The first papal abdication in 6 centuries. His successor, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who took the name Francis, born in Buenos Aires but of Italian descent, Roman blood. Though no pope has taken the name Peter II, the Vatican suddenly received hundreds of letters from the faithful around the world, all asking the same thing. Is this the final pope? One internal document I found recorded a meeting of the cardinals in 2014, just months after Francis's election. During it, a young bishop expressed concern that this prophecy is being weaponized to fuel apocalyptic anxiety and undermine reform. The dean of the college replied simply, "The Church does not fear the end. We only fear that people stop living for tomorrow." Another file titled Legendum non publicandum, to be read, not published, documented a Vatican commission that had once investigated the true origins of the prophecy. Several scholars argued the entire text was written in the late 16th century to support specific candidates in a papal conclave. One historian asked bluntly, "If Malachi truly wrote this, why is it never mentioned for 400 years?" But, in the end, the Vatican reached no official conclusion. The file ends with a line that says, "We do not publish what may confuse, even in order to deny it." And so the prophecy remains a ghost, neither authenticated nor erased, neither confirmed nor condemned. It has become part of the mythos surrounding the Vatican, like hidden staircases, secret chapels beneath the basilica, or whispers of angels during papal elections. Is it real? Does it matter? Perhaps those questions no longer require answers. As one elderly bishop once whispered to me while turning the final page of that prophecy, "There are words God never spoke, but left behind for men to decide whether to believe or not." The archive labelled Archivio Pio Puisi Anni di Guerra remained sealed for more than 70 years. It was not until 2020 that parts of it were finally declassified. But even those disclosed were only the surface. When I stepped into that room, the fresh air of the Vatican hallways seemed to vanish, replaced by an invisible weight. Pages unstained by blood, yet heavy with the silent deaths of millions. I opened a folder titled Lettere non risposte, 1942. Unanswered letters. Inside were dozens of pleas from Jewish communities across Europe, written during the most brutal years of the Holocaust. One letter, dated August 1942, came from a rabbi in Slovakia. It read, "We do not ask for a public intervention. We only ask that you affirm that God is not silent." There was no reply in the file, only a pencil mark on the margin. Forwarded to the Secretariat of State, response pending. Another folder recorded Vatican contacts with Nazi officials. In a memorandum dated November 1939, the German ambassador to the Vatican, Diego von Bergen, pledged, "The Reich will respect religious freedom if the Holy See maintains neutrality on internal matters." Cardinal Maglione, then Secretary of State, replied, "We do not intervene in politics, but we will speak if innocent life is threatened." And yet, if that voice spoke, it never reached the public. One internal report shook me to the core. A document addressed directly to Pope Pius V and dated October 1943, just weeks after Jews in Rome were deported by fascist authorities. It stated, nearly 1,000 Jews were taken from the city on October 16th. The train departed from Tiburtina station, destination unknown. The report was signed by a Jesuit priest from a local parish. There was no directive attached. But on the following page, in faint, trembling handwriting, someone had written, "Could not prevent. Prayer is the last recourse." I found no handwritten orders from Pius XIII commanding silence, but I found absence in speeches, messages, public declarations, throughout the period when Jews were being slaughtered en masse. A folder titled Discorsi Mancanti, Missing Speeches, contained drafts of 3 addresses that were never delivered. One of them, dated December 24, 1942, bore the title Sicut Stellae in Nocte, like stars in the night. In it was the line, "We grieve for the millions of innocents destroyed, whether for their race, their faith, or their language." But that message was never read aloud. A note beside it read, "Would endanger German parishes must wait." But the waiting never ended. Still, the Vatican did not remain entirely silent behind closed doors. I read hundreds of records documenting secret efforts to save Jews, especially through monasteries, churches, and religious institutions across Italy, France, and Poland. A 1944 file noted, "Santa Brigida Convent has hidden over 200 Jews disguised as pilgrims. The abbot accepts personal responsibility if discovered." There were dozens more such cases, yet no public statement from the Holy See confirmed or protected these actions, because a single word could have dragged hundreds out into the light and to their deaths. A letter from Bishop Angelo Rota in Budapest, dated 1944, read, "If we speak, they will kill more. If we remain silent, our conscience will die." There was no recorded reply. But in a private memo I found a handwritten line, unsigned, "To choose between voice and life, no one is holy enough to choose rightly." After the war, a file labeled Difese e Silenzi, Defenses and Silences, contained transcripts of internal meetings preparing for the coming wave of criticism. One cardinal suggested a public statement that the Holy See had quietly saved lives during the Nazi reign. The proposal was rejected. Instead, the Vatican chose continued silence and let the world debate. One final note read, "We do not speak. History will find the words, and history has never stopped searching. Some say Pope Pius V lacked courage, others say he did all he could within the limits of his office and time, but what I saw in the archives was not a judgment. It was the fractured record of a moment when moral clarity was pushed to its limits. There were no heroic proclamations, no apologies, only the lingering truth of a cold reality. Silence, whether born of fear or strategy, leaves an echo that cannot be erased. After hundreds of hours of reading, turning page after worn page, deep beneath the earth where no bells ring and no candles flicker, I began to ask myself, why does the Vatican keep all of this? Skeptics might say, to control, to conceal, to avoid facing truth. But if that were all, why not destroy it long ago? Why preserve, with such care and precision, every internal memo, every unanswered plea for help, every draft of a speech never spoken? I gradually came to understand the Vatican doesn't merely preserve truth, it preserves the complexity of truth. In those archives, there are no justifications, no blatant lies. There are gaps, silences, half-told stories. But there are also voices once buried at the bottom of history, questions never allowed to echo, and small, quiet acts that saved hundreds of lives without asking to be credited. The Vatican knows, better than anyone, a truth spoken at the wrong time can become a weapon, and so they choose to hold it, not to manipulate, but to wait. They do not rush to open every door at once. They believe each generation should only know what it is ready to understand. And that, difficult as it may be, is also a form of responsibility. I still remember the room at the far end of the Western Hall, a small chamber behind an old wooden door inscribed with the Latin words Veritas temporis est. Truth belongs to time. Inside, there were no files, only a wooden desk and a blank book. The elderly archivist whispered to me, "This is where no more questions are asked. Only listening remains." I sat there, not to write, but to reread in silence every chapter I had encountered. From secret meetings with emperors to hidden works of art, miracle investigations, Vatican silence during World War II, the role of women, of science, of rituals never performed, all flowing like an invisible current through millennia. I did not leave with answers, but I did leave with a certainty. The Vatican Archives is not where truth is buried, but where truth is protected from oversimplification. Truth does not always comfort. Sometimes it reveals popes who doubted, saints who faltered, and angels in paintings that wear the face of fear. But it is that kind of truth that makes faith, if it survives, truly mature. And perhaps that is why the archive continues to open, not in line with history, but with the conscience of humankind. When we are brave enough to look at the unvarnished face of faith, then the doors of the Vatican will open, not with a key, but with the quiet readiness to understand and to forgive. I did not leave the Vatican feeling as though I had exited a fortress of secrets, but rather a chapel waiting for someone to return. Not to worship, but to listen to history, to memory, and to oneself. If what you've just heard feels like more than a story, if it feels like a door quietly opening to something deeper, if you believe truth does not always lie on the surface, and that sometimes silence is its own form of storytelling, please consider supporting this channel by clicking subscribe, not just to walk with us through the journeys ahead, but to help keep this kind of deep storytelling alive in a world crowded with noise. Your single subscription is like a candle, lit among the shadows of an archive filled with memory and silence. Thank you for listening, with patience and with heart. I'll see you in the next story.